Hello and welcome to the Room of Lives. I'm your host, Neil. You're listening to the second part of my conversation with Pace Davis. In this part, Pace begins with how he transformed the destructive anger and anti-authoritarianism of his high school days into a more constructive force for social activism. During his undergraduate at the University of Texas, Pace joined the group United Students Against Sweatshops. They occupied the office of the university president and got arrested, but the campaign eventually succeeded in requiring that the university make sure their sports apparel did not come from sweatshops. In this context, Pace shares his views on the capitalism of large corporations dealing with local governments and labor unions. We then discuss the culture of worshipping ambition and wealth over morality in highly successful people, as exemplified by some of the personality cults that we see in today's tech world. We move on to Pace's experiences of traveling to West Bank with the International Solidarity Movement, which he has elaborated on in a previous episode. Here, he discusses the political situation in Israel and Palestine and their relationship with the U.S. We also talk about U.S. military foreign policy and how it's generally perceived by Americans. If you enjoy this podcast, consider supporting me by donating DAI or Ether to abranil.eth. That's ABHRANIL.ETH.
And so I decided to start working in this organization called the Palestine Solidarity Committee. There's two aspects. One, I felt like the work we were doing was good because we were fighting on the side of what I felt like was right, which was liberation for Palestinians, self-determination for Palestinians. And in addition to that, I also made this incredible group of friends who I felt like were a moral force. They were all kind of turning against what was normal. And I think now it's interesting in today's environment, right? It's 2019 now, right? We have social justice, social issues are more pervasive than they were 10 years ago, 11 years ago when I began the work. And so the group of people I met were basically bucking the norm. They were being the odd people out at the parties. I mean, when they were together, everyone had similar opinions about some things. But if you went to a regular party and you talked about Palestine, it was like, why would you ruin this great time we're having by bringing these politics into it? In 2008, the norm was not necessarily being pro-Israel, but the norm was thinking of Israel as fun and Arabs as not fun. And in college language, right, in the university language, was that if you're at a party and someone's talking about their great time on a beach at Birthright, the normal thing to do was to be like, beaches sound so cool, Tel Aviv sounds amazing. And what the people I met in this group were doing is instead they were saying, like, tell me about this birthright of yours to go to a land you've never seen, when like my friend or my mother can't ever go to the land they were born in. So like, let's talk about the word birthright. And at a party that's like, you've now harshed the mellow of this party, you've now ruined the fun vibe. But I found this to be really inspiring, meeting these people, that they were kind of willing to constantly interrogate their values and push back against the norms of others, and push back against the incredible social pressure to make jokes of a certain type or to always think that everything's funny. So I think I was drawn to that. Along with the actual specific work, I was drawn to these kind of people. I had never encountered them on any. I mean, I guess you could argue that my misfit friends in high school and I were kind of like this in a different way, but our efforts were almost totally destructive. Whereas this seemed like the constructive. It seemed like the natural path to take from being destructive to turning this anger into a constructive anger. And so I think I was drawn to this like constructive anger model of social organizing. So I did that for about 2 years with Palestine Solidarity Committee, and then
was this simultaneous with your studies at the university?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I should say I took 6 years to get a college degree. I changed my majors, and then I added Arabic in my third year. And in order to get an Arabic major, to get a degree in Arabic, I had to study for an additional 4 years, for 4 full years. I didn't end up getting the degree by, I think, 2 classes, but I got close, and I studied Arabic as much as I wanted, which I think was the goal. It was eventually to go live in the Middle East with the Arabic program, which I did not end up doing. I went to the West Bank instead. But I should say that, so I was getting involved while I was studying the whole time. I was a student the whole time. And you know, in a weird way, like I think also funny enough, taking 6 years, going part-time my last year, and becoming very political on campus is exactly what everybody doesn't want to happen with students, right? It's kind of like everyone wants students to get in and keep their nose down and graduate in 4 years. The graduation rates look good. Yeah. They don't want them to become politicized. They want them to become good workers. And I did the exact opposite. I saw the University of Texas as this opportunity to become the opposite of a good worker, basically. So that was a really neat. I'm glad I had that experience. And then my last semester at the University of Texas, funny enough, it was only a semester, but it felt like kind of like a lifetime, as I met these wonderful students who are a few years younger than me. They were sophomores, I think, maybe juniors, and they were part of a group called the United Students Against Sweatshops, and they were running this campaign. Just a couple of them were basically working all the time on this, all their free time on it, and it was this campaign to basically try to get the University of Texas to sign on with a third-party factory monitoring organization to monitor the factories that University of Texas apparel was made in. So a little background on this would be that there's a famous incident where I believe it was Kathy Lee Gifford. It's been long enough now where I may have misspoke on her name, but a famous person's had a clothing line that was made and sold in the United States, but it was discovered that it was being made in a sweatshop, and this is in the 1990s, right? And so this sweatshop reality is suddenly thrust into the American psyche, right? That these goods from abroad aren't made in factories where people are paid the wages that we expect people to be paid in the United States, right? So it created this crisis, right? And this is a really good example of capitalism's ability to pivot, right? In these very small moments, right? So instead of ending sweatshop conditions, right, which we think would be the natural thing that would follow finding out about sweatshops, Bill Clinton teamed up with Nike and I believe Adidas and a couple other major corporations and started what's called the Fair Labor Association. So instead of allowing others to police them, they would create their own self-policing organizations, and they would write the standards by which they were policed. And Bill Clinton actually was a major player in founding this movement. So that's to give you an idea of someone who's supposed to be kind of this moral leader, this president, right? Sees this problem of sweatshops and then creates a basically fake organization to deal with the problem. And so, a group of like basically unions and the student organization and some, I think, international trade unions basically funded a group called the Worker Rights Consortium, which actually was a true third-party organization. And to give the alternatives, the Fair Labor Association would call the factory a week before they came and say, we're coming by on October 5th to inspect the factory. So what the factory manager knows is to hide all the workers who might complain. And the workers are interviewed on the factory floor next to their managers about their working conditions, right? So that you'll never get a true, kind of objective picture of the conditions in the factory. So this third-party organization was started where if companies agreed to use it, they would be inspected. The factory had to guarantee, like say Nike, had to guarantee access to any of their factories to this organization, and it was a total surprise. So they would walk up to the front door on a Monday and they would just bang on the door and say, "We're the workers' rights. We're here to look at the conditions." And then they would ask for the names and addresses of the workers, and they would go interview them at night at their homes.
Oh shit! Okay.
So the idea was to get an objective idea of the condition of work. So there's some really upsides to this, and there's some problems. The way that capitalism works regarding T-shirt purchasing. So let's say you and I both want a black T-shirt. We just want a black T-shirt. We don't want it to be a nice black T-shirt. We don't particularly need someone to think that it was made at a nice place. We don't need the brand to be important. So let's say that we're looking between Hanes and Fruit of the Loom, right? Now let's say that pressure is put on Hanes to use higher wages, right? And let's say Hanes passes that cost on as 50 cents per T-shirt more. Well, the average consumer will just buy the Fruit of the Loom shirt because it's now, the 6-pack is $3 cheaper, right? So it's very hard to encourage, and the term is called the race to the bottom.
Yeah.
So if the wages rise in one country, Fruit of the Loom will leave that country and they will find a country where they can make cheaper T-shirts. And the average consumer doesn't care about where their black T-shirt comes from. Now, there are consumers that do care, and they can be charged a premium price, and like Patagonia or REI are great examples of seizing that market, right? But there's one area in which that's not true, and that's college apparel. And so this group of students had this incredible foresight to realize that if you're a fan of the University of Texas, you are not going to buy a University of Alabama T-shirt because it's $5 cheaper. And so you can actually leverage the loyalty to the university to require all of the garments that are made at all universities to be made honoring the labor laws of the country. And so this organization basically started with the help of some labor unions in the 90s to combat this. And they ran a variety of campaigns, living wage campaigns at their local universities, and these anti-sweatshop campaigns. And so I signed on with this group in February of 2012, and they were fighting to require the University of Texas to affiliate with this third-party monitoring organization. And it was a historic battle because not a single Southern university had fallen to this campaign attempt. It had been tried. It had been one in the Northeast. It had been on the West Coast. It had never been one in the South. And the other reason it was historic is because the University of Texas was the largest recipient of revenue from apparel licensing in the world. In 2010, I think they got $10.9 million, not off apparel, but off of licensing the logo and color of the University of Texas to apparel manufacturers. So you can imagine this is huge, right? So this campaign, the staff of the United Students Against Sweatshops, the organization is really throwing everything they have to help us. Because if we can win this campaign, this is the South falling, effectively, right? That's the idea behind it. And so I sign on, and there are these like just phenomenal student organizers, so young, so talented, that end up becoming some of my best friends, some of the people I admire most in the world. And I just saw, like, Palestine is this very long-term kind of slow grind, right? That things are constantly getting worse in Palestine. Even if things are getting better in the political climate of the United States, the realities in Palestine are constantly getting worse for Palestinians, right? They're worse than ever in Gaza. They are worse than ever in the West Bank. But politically, the climate is shifting internally in the U.S. So you're fighting a kind of a very long-term fight for justice. But with this, it was like a start and stop of a campaign. And I was very attracted to this. And the model USAS uses is just incredible. I mean, they're effective. They're intelligent. They know how to build. They know how to drive people. And so I signed on to this, and it started with these rallies and these letter deliveries to the president. And he kind of refused to meet with us and refused to interact with us because we were just students demanding things. And so the culmination of this campaign was we worked all semester, and eventually we, 18 of us, occupied the president's office at the University of Texas and refused to leave. So we arrived at like 10 or 11 in the morning.
So he was in there?
So the president's office is very big at UT. So you get off on the president's office is on an entire floor of the tower. So if you
in the main tower.
Yeah, if you can imagine, there's a security guard. There's a set of doors that can lock with a button. Then there's all of his support staff. And then there's his office itself, which is like another 25 feet back. He also has a secret exit. So if he's in the office, he can like sneak out basically through a side corridor. So we didn't make it all the way into his personal office, but we made it into the office where all of his support staff was. So we occupied it. And the thing is, for political purposes, it doesn't really matter if we make it in front of him or if we make it in his office. We have now occupied a space that we're not supposed to be in. We've now occupied a space where people want us out of. And so we occupied it, and we did a tremendous campaign coordination for publicity with other students and faculty. We got a lot of support and sign-on. So we were all arrested at the end of the day because they said at 5 o'clock this office closes, and if you're still here, it's criminal trespassing. And we all planned to get arrested. And what they thought is that we were going to leave because we didn't want to get arrested. But we had all the legal things coordinated, and we wanted to get arrested. We wanted to use being arrested as students speaking up for workers' rights as a lever against the president. So we were arrested, and a lot of times the presidents will give in shortly after the arrest, but he was not giving in. So then we stepped up our efforts even more, and we went in his neighborhood, and we flyered in his neighborhood about him refusing to agree to workers' rights. We did a vigil outside of his house in front of all of his neighbors with a priest. We did a second fake sit-in in front of important donors and staff of the university on the same day as a retirement party for a major staff member. And so as we picked up steam, basically what happened was we became so annoying. And this was the point, right? The point was that he was never going to give in to our demand because he didn't care. We weren't to be taken seriously because it didn't matter that we cared about this. But once we became a huge thorn in his side, in his mind, I mean, this is a man who controls budgets in the millions and millions and millions of dollars at the University of Texas, right? This is a man who decides where hundreds of millions of dollars are spent, who's responsible for coordinating the raising of hundreds of millions of dollars a year, right? Maybe even, almost $1 billion, right? Once we became annoying enough, he agreed to sit down with us and agreed to sign on to this $50,000 a year fee to have the factory. He said, okay, fine. He basically said, oh, that makes sense. Okay. Yeah, sure. And we won. And the neat part was I fought it. I got to meet with the president. I was one of the 4 students who was in the meeting with the president arguing for this. He said, I'll do some research and I'll get back to you. And he agreed to it about a month and a half later when I was already in Palestine. And as the semester was coming to an end, I was graduating and I was wondering what I was going to do with my free time. And I had come into a little bit of money from my grandfather passing away. And I had, never known what I wanted to do after college because I'd never thought that far. And so instead of going to work, applying to...
So one quick question that I've been thinking about, though, as far as the whole, the sweatshop ethical dilemma is concerned, this kind of relates to the race to the bottom thing that you mentioned. There is an argument that I've heard. It's essentially the free market argument that imagine that you have a sweatshop in Bangladesh and the conditions inside are really very miserable. But these workers are not coming and working there involuntarily. They have chosen to come and work in this because they cannot find work anywhere else. So I mean, you must have encountered this argument before then. Well, why is it? Where is the evil? Why is it the sweatshop's responsibility in a free market?
So I guess what I should say, the thing that I find that argument misses is that a sweatshop is actually not defined as a factory that violates United States of America labor laws. It's actually defined as a factory that violates, I think it's at least 2 of the local labor laws of the nation in which it's operating, right? So when people say these people aren't involuntarily coming there, what they're actually doing, and this should also be said, that many of the constitutions that were written after ours, many of them that were written in the 19th and 20th century in the world, actually have labor protections written into them. So the United States is one of the weakest modern nation labor law, modern nations in regards to labor laws. Mexico has paid maternity leave written into its constitution. Does that mean maternity leave is paid? No. So it's the enforcement of the laws. So we actually aren't requiring, our goal as an organization was actually never to demand that this factory, say in Haiti or in Bangladesh, right, honors the labor laws of the United States of America.
Yeah.
It was to require that they actually honor the local labor laws.
Okay.
And so one of the arguments this kind of capitalist, like, these people aren't voluntarily their thing, misses is that it's not actually that these companies go to this country, honor the labor laws, and abuse these people. It's that these companies actually go to these countries and they bribe officials to ignore their own labor laws. Or they come to a country and they say, well, we're going to open this factory, but your labor laws are pretty strict. So if you could turn away from your own people and their rights, we would love to operate here. And it gets even worse. It actually gets so bad that, like, when Haiti considered raising its minimum wage, Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, personally intervened to stop the nation from raising its own minimum wage, right? And I'm sure her argument was that it'll drive business out of Haiti, right? But this is a foreign nation intervening on the domestic laws or policies of a nation. And that's actually what corporations do around the world. They intervene as foreign actors, right? They're a corporation that's from outside that country, and they twist the arm of a nation. So I think that I think this is an interesting thing, because a lot of times it gets pulled down to the simple idea of, well, this is capitalism, right? But I mean, that's a type of capitalism which we generally, and not everyone, agree is not positive. It's a negative impact on the world. And so I think it's one of those things like, you look at Foxconn, you look at these major factory collapses in Bangladesh specifically, right? And there are workers that are calling the government, they're calling their representatives, and they're saying, this factory's there's cracks through the walls, there's cracks through the floors, it looks really risky in here, there's no way to get out, there's a fire, right? And according to their laws, there should be intervention, right? But because of the wealth of those in charge, no intervention ever comes. And then the factory collapses and 600 people die under the rubble, right? And then 100 people die or whatever. And then the company claims, well, it was a subcontractor, right? Yes, we were making phones there, but it wasn't an Apple factory. It was a foreign factory, right? So we owe nothing to the workers there, even though Apple representatives walked through that factory, even though Apple representatives have been contacted about the working violations. So there's this really good way internationally to basically continually push responsibility off on somebody else while you're actively breaking laws and regulations. So that was our messaging around it. And I think it's the messaging that I admire. And then it's basically saying, like, okay, if you honor the local labor laws, go do whatever that country will allow you within the rights that those people have vested through their constitution. And then there's the other discussion of, well, what if those labor laws make it so expensive that no one wants to operate there? Okay, well, that's another discussion. And I think that's one of the arguments that capitalists, people who are for this kind of free market operation, make, that countries need to incentivize companies to operate there. Yeah. But that is the race to the bottom. It's that they move to the cheaper place until they're effectively getting their labor for basically free. I also think it's one of those things where, like, regulating capitalism is an interesting thing, and it's a touchy thing, right? But if you think about the rate at which a worker makes a t-shirt, it's not one t-shirt every hour, right? So if their wage is 20 cents an hour and you raise their wage to 25 cents an hour, right, which may actually be the difference between being able to feed their family and struggling to feed their family, that doesn't mean that each t-shirt costs 5 cents more. That might actually mean that each t-shirt costs them a fraction of 1 cent more to make, right? And I think one of the interesting things that we see is that those costs get passed on far more than they actually cost, right? And so I think it's also kind of a lie, right? Corporations are making profit, and there's an interesting documentary Michael Moore made before he made Bowling for Columbine, and it was actually about this. I think it's about a Payday, Payday the candy bar. Yeah. Their factory moved overseas, so they recorded record profits the year before they moved, and then they recorded record profits the year they moved. So the argument they made of, oh, well, it's just we have to move to make money. was interesting because when you looked at their books, right, it wasn't actually that they weren't making money. They made record profits. They just saw on the horizon the opportunity to make more money. And so when a corporation's sole goal is to maximize profits, right, it creates this issue. But also, anyone, I think, who's been around businesses enough knows that there's a degree of total bullshit in this argument, because we know that there is wasted administrative expenses in all corporations. We know that there are people who work in marketing or work in social media or like the personal assistants of all of the C-level executives. So we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that these people don't actually mind waste. Right? We know that they're willing to waste money. Like we know it. We see it in our public administrations. We see it in our private administrations. I think there are a lot of companies in the world that could operate much leaner than they do, but everyone gets to feel more important if they operate as bloated as they are at the right levels. So I think also that's like one of those interesting big lies, right? Even oil, right? Like oil and gas pays people well enough to get them to do these dangerous jobs, but they could probably cut wages a little bit and still get people to work for them, right? And then they have all of these kind of bloated level executives in oil and gas, right?
And those are the people who are deciding where the budget goes. So
exactly.
they don't particularly have a lot of pressure on cutting their own. I'm just gonna get rid of my secretary, and you're not gonna have like donuts and cream cheese every morning. They're the ones deciding where the money goes. It's pretty easy to kind of tighten the belts on the people that are below them.
Because they don't see them or know them.
So people on the factory floor are not the ones that are determining how the money is being spent. So
and and I mean, I think it's really important to say that I think this kind of that the average person who argues this, like, well, this is just the way capitalism works. So you should include. I think they should also include that capitalism also includes killing labor leaders, right? Like capitalism traditionally in labor worldwide, not just in Honduras, but worldwide, right? Historically, in the 20th century and into the 21st and in the 19th century, if you were a prominent labor leader, you could actually be murdered. So like if you worked at a factory in Honduras and you were fighting for a union there, right? Someone could show up to your house and shoot you in the face. So that's actually illegal, right? That's like outside of the bounds of legality, right? And so it's also interesting because a lot of times those arguments are made of like, well, this is like legal, is how capitalism works. But like these corporations have no qualms about breaking any laws they see fit to continue to make money, right? So I think like it's also one of those things where with anything, with politics, right? With any disagreement, philosophies, right? When you have bad actors, right, that like exit the moral sphere, right, that the system doesn't function, right? And so I think like same thing, right, is like we can all talk about this idea that violence is we can all say like nonviolence is the only way, right? But if the real struggle comes when someone refuses to abide by our moral agreements and they start murdering people, right? Then you say, well, okay, we can all stick to nonviolence and die, right? Or we can exit the moral sphere and we can try to bring them back inside the moral sphere, right? We have to bring them inside these moral agreements. And I think with corporations, I think that there's this really false, and I think it's been very well, I think especially with tech, I think that they have done a tremendous job of creating cults of personality around their founders, around wealthy people in America. I mean, we look at the average person now, it seems like in a city, tech, especially tech related, they literally worship the CEOs of corporations as replacements for religion, right? Like they look at what was Steve Jobs, right? This man, by all accounts, is actually a terrible person, right? Like he's unlikable, he's rude, he's dismissive, he abandoned a child, right? I mean, this, by all of our accounts for who you actually want to be friends with, he meets almost none of those standards, right? And yet the way people admire Steve Jobs is pretty scary, right? And Steve Jobs didn't care about the moral sphere. And I think that corporations, I think that's one of the things that is eerie, right? Is that is that we don't admire people generally today. I mean, not we, but I mean, many people don't admire people who are actually good people, who contribute to a better world. We admire people who make incredible wealth at the expense of whatever. And so anyway, so the United Students Against Sweatshops, I thought was a great organization because it actually pushed back and said, there has to be some moral guidelines by which these things happen. And we aren't actually opposed. Like, I mean, there are many anti-capitalists in the United Students Against Sweatshops. But the organization was not inherently opposed to capitalism. It was opposed to these globalization efforts that were excessive and which broke all of the laws of all of the nations they operated in for extractive purposes.
So anyway, back to this was
Sorry.
We were talking. By the way, so since you just mentioned, this is too much of a coincidence for me not to mention this right now, but a couple nights back, I was actually on some of your 4ACO DMT.
Okay.
I have no problems just saying that on the podcast. But I got this sudden idea of a Molotov seminar that I want to give in the near future. And it would be about this kid who came up with the idea of Ethereum, which is like this decentralized world computer thing, using similar protocols as Bitcoin does for a central or third-party less system for instead of trust, it's just this smart contracts that settle all kinds of stuff in between people, like rent or insurance or money payments and stuff like that. And a certain kind of religious cult is developing around him. Much to his own dislike, but it is happening. And I know about this because I've been following it for a while, and I can see all the people, like there's people make religious imagery of this kid, like his name is Vitalik Buterin. They call him by religious names. There are people like who'll wear like beads and stuff. I mean, it's kind of interesting. So I think there's a whole interesting intersection of many different things here. So there's of course the nature of the technology that he has pioneered, which is, you know, its goal is to bring power back to the people, and people think of it as kind of almost like a new religion that is going to solve a lot of problems. But there's also the kind of long tradition, which I recently came to know, between Silicon Valley and like a techno religion kind of thing. And what role does, you know, psychedelics have to play in these techno religions? So I want to read a little bit more about this stuff, and I want to give this talk about Vitalik Buterin. Is Vitalik Buterin a modern god? And where do these ideas come from? What does this dynamic share with with traditions of religion that humanity has? Anyway, so
that's cool. I mean it's something I've thought a lot about, this idea that who we admire, who we canonize in our modern world without God.
It's true. So but you were talking about towards the end of college, I guess you said your grandfather passed away, and you said there was this financial windfall in the family.
I was lucky enough to get $5,000, and I used it to buy a one-way ticket to live in the West Bank and work with the International Solidarity Movement there. I had met one of the founders, spoke at University of Texas when I was there with our group. We brought her, and then in addition to that, an active member of the group in 2010 came and spoke. She had been active in 2009, I think, and she came and spoke and was a big influence. And I just thought they were doing really neat work. They kind of fell outside of the models that I had known, right? So they're not an NGO. They're an organization that basically functions kind of day to day through individual donations. So no one really decides the trajectory of the organization but the organization itself. So I thought that was really neat. They're Palestinian led, meaning that Palestinian organizations decide what they do. not that they can be told to do anything, but an organization can contact them and say, hey, our village is being attacked. We'd like you to come work with us. And at its peak, ISM had like sometimes 100 or almost 200 members, I think, at its very biggest peak during the Intifada. And it had shrunk quite a bit. By the time I got there, the organization fluctuated from, at the smallest point, I think 4, and at the biggest point, like 60 members. So I arrived in June of 2012 and kind of immediately encountered the reality of the occupation of the West Bank. And speaking of evil, right? I mean, this is a really great example of the banality of evil, right? The average Israeli doesn't go home and beat their spouse, right? The average Israeli doesn't torture their child, right? The average Israeli isn't this movie evil, right? They aren't a master villain, right? The average Israeli goes to work. They're probably about as boring as the average American is generally. They want to buy some stuff. Like, the kind of IKEA trips are the highlight of their week. They like TV. They like nice things. They wish they were richer than they are, right? I mean, the average Israeli, I think, is not an exceptional person, right? Any more so than the average American is exceptional. But the average Israeli thinks that a Muslim or Christian Palestinian life is actually less than theirs. And they think that in the balance of things, Palestinians must die for them to have freedom. That's, and if you ask them in that exact way, they might say no. But every decision that the average Israeli makes politically, right? Every decision that the nation of Israel makes politically says exactly that. And so the average Israeli has gone to work and watched TV and like gone swimming and made food while in many cases mere miles away. Millions of people, right, in Gaza and in the West Bank are under brutal either siege or military occupation. Many Israelis live 30 minutes from a settlement, right? So this would be like the equivalent of, and then what's so interesting is the average Israeli has almost no knowledge of Palestinian life, right? Even though 20% of the Israeli population is Palestinian and has citizenship within Israel, right? Even though there are like almost 2 million Palestinians in the West Bank and there are over 2 million in Gaza, right? So the average Israeli is the distance we are from San Marcos. The average Israeli might be from a settlement. The average Israeli might be from a military post in the West Bank. The average Israeli might be from the wall that divides sections of the West Bank from itself and then sections of the West Bank from Israel. And then the average Israeli is served in the military because it's a requirement. So that was really something to see, right? Is to see this, to see the mental gymnastics. I mean, and I think that it had this, one of the things I experienced there was you'll see these legal systems that have been put in place to make it basically impossible for Palestinians to have justice, right? Both the average Israeli is so prejudiced, right? And the laws are prejudiced, and the systems are prejudiced, and the opportunities are prejudiced, right? And they don't even apply to the same court systems for things. They aren't arrested by the same police. They aren't dealt with, right? Because they're not citizens. They're basically considered enemy combatants under occupation, right? And so I think what you see when you're there is really just this, the banality of evil, the true banality of evil. I mean, right now in Gaza, like 80%, 90% of the water is now undrinkable. Children are dying from poison water, right? There's sewage that's just dumping into the streets, right? It's dumping into the sea. It's ruining their ability to fish because they're dumping so much sewage into their own sea because they have nowhere else to put it. They aren't allowed to build anything. Concrete is not allowed into Gaza, so they aren't allowed to rebuild, right? There's this thing you'll see posted like Gazans should shelter when bombing happens. Well, there are no shelters. They aren't allowed to build them because the government would accuse Palestinians of using them for Hamas, and so there are no shelters. So if you tell someone in Gaza to be safe during the bombing, that's not possible. It'd be like sitting in Whitehall and saying, well, Austin's getting bombed. Whitehall is as safe a place as any, right? And so this all goes on day to day, and the Israeli society has decided and again, not every day through major kind of decisions, and they constantly reaffirm the occupation. So I don't want to pretend that the Israeli society fights the occupation. It doesn't at all. But every day, all of the myriad decisions that are made at all of the bureaucratic and military levels are made to continue to extract resources from Palestinians. They take their water, they take their soil, they take their resources, and then to continue to transfer their population into the West Bank to settle. And even being there, there's this really great story Israel uses. In 2005, they withdrew from Gaza. And they went to the world and they said, look, we withdrew from Gaza. Look how generous we are. We left Gaza. Okay, so we ended our military occupation of a place. Look how generous we are. And then Gaza elected Hamas. And so Israel used that as an excuse to immediately put them under blockade. And so from that point forward, they've been under total siege, right? Well, one of the stories that Israel doesn't tell when they tell this story was that there were about 30 or 40 families that were settled in Gaza. So that's not that many people, right? But these people had to be under military protection. Now, the military cost to protect only 30 or 40 families in a Palestinian area of millions of people, right, is extreme. When they removed these families from Gaza, for their own budgetary concerns, truly, I mean, they pretended that it was a generous act, but what they were doing is they were making an intelligent, logical decision to say, it's very expensive to protect these couple hundred people here with thousands and thousands of troops in enemy territory, right? Quote unquote, enemy territory. Instead, we'll settle 10,000 new settlers in the West Bank as a political exchange. And that's what happened, right? So they approved thousands of new homes being built in the West Bank in exchange for these few settler families being removed. And the settler movement still was very angry. They said they were being betrayed, right? But I mean, this is what Israel goes around the world saying, that they're generous. But that is the actual reality of the generosity. And I think that being there was this very formative experience regarding seeing kind of how corporations and nations and individuals can justify all this stuff if you only look at things in the micro decisions and you say, yeah, this one police shooting looks like it may have been justified, right? So all police shootings maybe, and then you look at everything that springs out of those kind of thoughts. And so I worked with the International Solidarity Movement, and I was the coordinator for a little over 5 months of the 6 months I was there. And so I became responsible for training volunteers that came in. I became responsible for helping with some of the media stuff and doing a lot of coordination with information.
What are the local and international policies regarding Palestine that you wanted to talk about?
I think, we talk about the United States. We talk about Israel is an incredibly wealthy nation, but it's the largest recipient of military aid from the United States in the world. So one of the wealthier nations on the face of the earth gets more military aid from us than any other nation. And it also gets other aid, like development aid. But what we have in the United States politically is we have a climate in which Israel cannot be criticized under any circumstances in any state legislature and in the federal government. We have a lobby that is incredibly powerful called AIPAC, which is the American Israel Political Action Committee, right? And they are funded by wealthy donors who support Israel. Many of them are Jewish, and then there's also an evangelical bent toward it as well. But there's an interesting aspect of it is that they lobby very successfully, and they run elections against people who don't toe the line. So the political climate is such that that for many years now, we actually as a nation have become more and more aggressive on Palestine. There's this idea that we're getting better, and I think the average individual may truly be getting better on their political views about Palestine, especially in liberal circles, especially in the Democratic Party, the lower end, the younger parts. But at the upper levels, I mean, we famously, Obama was more quiet on settlements than previous presidents, including George W. Bush, right? So there's this idea that I think there's this like false idea in the Democratic Party we have, people who vote for it, right? Either who are in it, support it, or vote for it. The Democrats are better on all these issues. And when you look at international politics, you actually find often the Democrats aren't any better. I think domestically, generally, we find that they have more socially generous positions, right? But like what we actually find with U.S. presidents is that each president gets worse on Palestine. Each president is more more in Israel's camp, right?
It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because following the Second World War, it might be seen that a very friendly relation with Israel is kind of morally the better thing to do. And so what is considered the more liberal approach to take is just kind of, because of the historical context, it's just kind of more fraught with it. It's just
well.
So I wonder what. I also wonder what. Okay, so you are a young person and you hang out in a lot of liberal groups. I wonder what kind of response you get for your views on Palestine and what you have done there. Are a lot of the people who vote Democrat and are liberal aligned with your views on Palestine?
So I think that there's a couple. I guess a couple things I could say about that. One, the reaction to my views has changed considerably since I began. It was basically considered that you didn't talk about Palestine in polite company when I began organizing. And years before that, it was even worse. Like the early 2000s, during the Iraq War, during President Bush's presidency, you basically were called a supporter of terrorism when the Intifada was happening, right? And the thing is the average American conflated Palestine and Hamas with Al Qaeda with Iraq, which are all rather separate entities, right? They don't know anything about the Arab world. That's changed. I would say that when I first started, it was kind of like, oh, don't be the bummer, I have Israeli friends, or don't be the bummer, I have Jewish friends who support Israel, and like I'm friends with you and I'm friends with them. Both of your positions are valid. And then there's the cocktail opinion, which is really the one that like probably irks me the most, which is the like, these are equal parties, they both do bad things, they're both equal actors in this reality. I don't like either one of their bad choices, which is a really interesting argument that's used for all kinds of purposes to basically sound and smart. I think it does a couple things for the individual who says it. It makes them sound knowledgeable. It makes them sound even-keeled. It makes them sound like they've thought about both sides and they see problems with both sides, and they're trying to basically offer this middle ground opinion that makes everyone happy but also says something that might be true. So that's the response that I feel like I still get sometimes, that's like the most annoying. It's very much a cocktail opinion. I don't find it to be an intellectual opinion or a thoughtful opinion. I find it to be, or the other thing we get, I think that you get people who have sympathy, but a lot of times now I think the conversation on Palestine has actually shifted enough in liberal circles to where supporters of Israel will have to couch it as that there are other problems with Palestine. They'll either have to bring up Hamas and terrorism. That's like the first thing. If they're ardent supporters of Israel, they will only refer to Hamas. They won't refer to the West Bank at all. They will only refer to Gaza, and they will refer to Hamas's original charter, which called for the destruction of the state of Israel. Hamas's charter was amended several years ago to take that out. Okay, so it's not the current charter of Hamas. Hamas has all kinds of problems, but just factually. They don't know that, though, because it's not a talking point. And then the other one you get is people who don't want anything to change will say things like, yeah, it's really sad what's happening to the Palestinian people, but they are really terrible to women. Or, but they like need to deal with their regressive Islam. Or, but, they're not helping themselves. Or, but if they were nonviolent, things would be different. And all of those are like, those I think are statements that you find kind of in liberal circles that are like, basically I think it's a way to say I don't actually want anything to change. I don't care at all if this changes. But they I think they miss the point, right? Which is that like there are people all over the world who are liberated, who have domestic abuse issues or conservative religious issues or whatever, and that Palestinians have been nonviolent for significant periods of their existence as an oppressed people vis-a-vis Israel, and that right now they're championing a movement called Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, which is totally nonviolent, and it's being fought harder than they've been fought in many ways before. To give you an example, Airbnb. Okay, so Airbnb banned Airbnbs in settlements in the West Bank. So Airbnb did not ban Airbnbs in Israel. Airbnb acknowledged that settlements are illegal under international law and that they shouldn't allow settlers to host rooms in occupied foreign territory, right? So they banned Airbnbs within the West Bank. They also did not allow Palestinians to use Airbnb. So effectively, Palestinians weren't allowed to rent their homes that were legal, and Israelis were allowed to rent their illegally settled homes. So Airbnb simply honored international law. And Airbnb says they don't rent homes in contested territory. That's like one of their ethics guidelines. So the response to that decision, not the decision to ban rentals in Israel, the decision to ban rentals in the West Bank, the occupied West Bank, is that the state of Texas is passing a law, or maybe already did pass a law this legislative session, making it impossible to get reimbursed as a state employee for staying in an Airbnb.
That's actually true. I got that email from my department staff a couple days back.
So it did pass.
Yeah, because we go to different states and cities for conferences, and sometimes people don't want to stay in the conference hotel because it's more expensive.
Yeah.
And we just got this email saying, hey, you can't stay in Airbnbs anymore. You're not going to be refunded.
Yeah.
But I didn't know that it had anything
so
to do
that's
with
it.
Yeah.
So you can imagine this is an interesting thing. This is a nation. This is a state prioritizing a foreign the feelings about a foreign nation, allegiances to a foreign nation, and not even punishing Airbnb because they actually boycotted a nation. Punishing Airbnb for acknowledging that they were violating, that they were helping violate international law, right? So this is the level of vitriol against the Palestinian non-violent movement for freedom and liberation. And it's one of those great examples of the way BDS is talked about in pro-Israel circles is that it seeks to eradicate the state of Israel. Now, if like you think about about South Africa, the apartheid ending, right? Well, yeah, if white people having absolute political authority and unequal power was eradicating the state of South Africa, then yes, BDS seeks to eradicate the state of Israel in the same way that the anti-apartheid movement sought to eradicate the state of South Africa. You can eradicate a political entity without killing a single person.
Yeah.
You can actually eradicate a political entity without particularly harming a single person, unless you consider harm to be that they don't have total political privilege and authority. And so yes, that's what the BDS movement does seek, but it's being... but I think that politically we are hearing it talked about more as actually killing Israelis. The BDS seeks to kill all Jewish Israelis, which is hilarious, but that's how it's spoken. And that's the level in this country politically that we're still at.
Yeah.
So that's concerning, and I think that we just make strange. I think people, when they're working again, like in these little movements towards evil, right? They make strange bedfellows, right? They make these micro decisions that land them with like very ugly actors, right? That land them with like hideous people they otherwise would never want anything to do with, but because politically you have an agenda, you have the same agenda, and that's what's kind of happening politically regarding Palestine. Is that Democrats and Republicans actually try to see who's more rabidly I think it could be called pro-Israel, but I think the way that it should be talked about in this nation is it's not actually pro-Israel. it's pro the death and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, because being pro-Israel, because all of Israel's national policies are geared toward settling the West Bank and besieging Gaza, right? So if you are pro-Israel, as it stands as a nation state today, you are inherently anti-Palestinian life. Because if all of the gears, if every university that's funded by the state of Israel is funded to make projects on things like how many calories a Palestinian in Gaza needs to stay alive, or the research at universities is how to best keep Palestinians docile in the West Bank as you settle it, or how much water can we extract from the West Bank, then the BDS movement makes perfect sense, because you could actually argue that every cog of the nation of the state of Israel, not every individual, but every political cog, every academic cog, every university, it all turns with a specific purpose to oppress and ethnically cleanse Palestinians from the land that it wants. And Israelis would argue that's not true. It's just a war between two peoples, except that one of those peoples has almost no might, has almost no money, right, in the grand scheme, has no military superiority, no power. They have, and that they are totally at the mercy of this occupying force. And so I think that one of the things that I think other people want to see shift too, and I do, is I want to see any pro-Israel stance actually talked about kind of what it is an anti-Palestinian life stance. Because if someone talks about Israel in a positive way and refuses to acknowledge the settlements, then they're effectively saying the settlements are okay. And they're effectively supporting the building of more settlements. Because there is no, and this is one of the things that people, I think, become astounded by, but really need to realize, is that there's this idea that there's a diversity of public opinion in the state of Israel. There is not a large, by diversity you mean how brutal should the occupation be, or how many people have to die, there is diversity in that. But if the question comes if you ask the question of should Palestinians have equal rights in the state of Israel, the diversity disappears. And so that diversity happens at a narrow band. And I think we see that here, and I think this is the reason I would say that Israel is not exceptional. Because we see that lack of diversity in the United States regarding our foreign policy. Right? You don't hear conversations that say, you didn't hear conversations around the Iraq War that said, should George Bush be tried for war crimes? And you didn't have a diversity of opinion. That question was never asked. Even though this man had invaded a nation, had convinced a nation, our nation, to invade a foreign nation on false claims, knowing they were false, right? Which seems like kind of the definition of something that someone could be tried for war crimes for, right? To say the Iraqis have weapons of mass destruction and they were tied to Al-Qaeda, which perpetrated 9/11. None of those being true at all, actually. And he knowingly said that, and Colin Powell knowingly said that in front of the United Nations, and Donald Rumsfeld knowingly lied about it, right? Dick Cheney, everyone, right? And there was never, ever once on a major national news station a conversation between two talking heads that said, should we arrest and prosecute any of the top-level military officials or government officials for war crimes, for violating the human rights of a foreign nation? So we talk about diversity of opinion, I think, and that's one of the really interesting things I think that is lacking and makes, countries like that drives my kind of interest in foreign policy and politics, is that we pretend that a diversity of opinions is bring the troops home or keep them there, but it's not like let's talk about Iraqi lives. It's let's talk about how many Americans are dying. How do you feel about Americans dying? How do you feel about American troops suffering? How do you feel about Americans being embarrassed by being involved in a war? And it's never actually, let's talk about the fact that 300,000 to 1 million Iraqis have died, right? It's never like, what's the opinion on those things, right? It's never couched in the lives of others, or our foreign policy is all, even around Trump, one of the scariest things, I think, that we see among Democratic voters, right? Who I think in the cities too, these are educated, very intellectual Democratic voters, is we don't actually see them talking about, they talk about Donald Trump as an embarrassment, they talk about Donald Trump as embarrassing, as annoying, as like the guy that keeps putting his foot in his mouth, as the guy that says really gross things, right? And it's not that nobody's talking about him in this other way, but it's alarming that the primary thing that Donald Trump is for the average wealthy or middle upper class intellectual American is an embarrassment. And when Obama was president, right, more deportations happened under Obama than had ever happened in the history of the United States, right? Obama was responsible for growing the drone striking program, for bombing sovereign nations sometimes around the clock without declaring war on them. He was responsible for continued rendition, which is taking someone from foreign soil, kidnapping them, flying them through a friendly foreign country to another foreign country that still tortures, and letting that country torture them for you. He was responsible to this very big growth of our military, flexing of our military might around the world in ways which weren't passed through Congress, right?
Actually, I remember the same day that the Boston Marathon bombing happened, it was kind of front page news, but several pages later there was a small article I remember reading where in a drone strike in Afghanistan, it killed a whole wedding party and left maybe one or two people alive. The rest of all this civilian wedding party, a bomb was dropped on them.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, so look at this Boston Marathon bombing. How many people died there? That's not a fair comparison necessarily, but there is so much power in the control of the narrative.
Yeah.
And the United States wields a lot of power. Not just, of course, it will control the narrative in its own country. Every country does that.
Yeah.
But it also controls the narrative in many other countries.
Absolutely.
Whether directly or indirectly, there are many other reasons that the United States might not have to exert any direct influence in order to control the narrative elsewhere, but there may be so many other reasons why that same kind of West-centered or the US-centered narrative is the one that is echoed everywhere. I was just imagining if the table turned, for the moment imagine that an Afghani drone landed a bomb on an American wedding.
The world would,
yeah. It would be crazy. It's unimaginable.
Yeah, I mean, we think about 9/11. 3,000 Americans died, right? And the blood that we've spilled in retribution for that attack is 150, 300 times the lives. You know, I mean, it's hard to even know. We can't even calculate because so much of it is secretive, right? And so it's alarming because I think politically, when I think about politics, it's really interesting because we really are, even if people are getting smarter or wiser or socially more, kind of adept, we really don't. And it's interesting because even in kind of left-leaning, more liberal, further left circles, is you'll hear this. You'll hear these policies of the government talked about, and they're very still talked about in these kind of Republican Democrat, good Democrat, bad Republican, right? Ways, right? Or something, or the separation of families happens, and this is a big deal. It's not a small thing, right? This is serious, but the outrage, the money raised when the term separation of families hits the American psyche, is eclipses in magnitude, right? Tenfold, who knows, 100-fold. The money raised for Iraqi victims of the war, our war, it eclipses the money raised for Afghani victims of our war. It eclipses the money raised for Yemeni victims. Yemenis are dying right now in Syrians too, in really horrifying conditions, real true starvation, which is famine in 2019. People are dying of not eating on a couch. And there's really no idea in the American psyche that this is our fault. It's like this kind of like inconvenience. And I think that really speaks, just like in Israel, it speaks to this idea of Israeli exceptionalism. Truly, deep down, the belief that a Jewish Israeli life is worth more than a Muslim or Christian Palestinian life. And truly, I think even you could divide it in like Western versus Eastern. Truly, the idea that a Western intellectual life is more valuable inherently than a brown Eastern life, right? And we see the same thing in the United States. And for example, we wouldn't drone strike France, right? But we will drone strike Yemen, Pakistan. We will bomb Cambodia when we're not even at war with them in Vietnam, and we won't say anything, and no one will even bat an eye. And even soldiers, they'll come home and having killed people in these nations, and we even talk about their suffering as the burden put on them, right? Not the burden that's been put on other people across the world, but the burden placed on them specifically, right? And I don't know if that'll ever change politically, but it's really, I think if you think about,
it's kind of interesting though that in a previous podcast that I did with Ian Benuis, who was a Black Hawk fighter pilot in the war on drugs, he said towards the end of the podcast he had some views on war as a political mechanism, and he said that the decisions are made here by politicians, but we are the people who have to go and fight the war, and then we are the people who end up with lifelong trauma because we have had to see the things that you guys will never want to see, and I don't wish anyone else to see. He talked about like his friends who like saw their friends dying or killed children, and then you have to live with that for the rest of your life. And he said that he believes that that using war as a political tool, its days should be over by now. But it isn't. And he said something kind of interesting. He said, we are the people that go into war. I feel like veterans are the ones who have to come back and send this message to the rest of society that we can't do this anymore. Because we bear the full brunt and force of what it means to go to war and fight. But anyway, I was just...
it's I agree with you. It's really interesting, but it is interesting that the average veteran comes back and instead is like, rah, 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 America, how dare you say anything against America. But if you ask, it's kind of odd because they have this kind of allegiance. I've had friends who are veterans, and if you ask them point blank, like, what did you think about being in Afghanistan? They're like, what the hell are we doing there? Our government has no idea what it's doing. All the news was a lie. Whenever they said we were winning, it was a total BS. It was a nightmare. But at the same time, they'll be like, these liberals, and it's interesting because they'll basically be like, these lame liberals, like soft liberals, don't understand, or like basically they fall into this like rah 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 America trap when they've been betrayed by America to a degree that the average American can't even imagine. They grew up, mostly they grew up poor, right? And they were incentivized to join the army because it was their chance out of poverty, and that their American political leadership, and that includes Democrats, right? The Iraq War was pretty unanimous, right? Betrayed them, had them go and commit war crimes, right? And then all got to live great lives, and they sleep wonderfully, right? Like that's the other thing, right? Is like the fact that Hillary Clinton can sleep at night, the fact that Barack Obama can sleep at night, the fact that George W. Bush can sleep comfortably at night is really a testimony to how flawed our political system is, right? Like you have veterans who come back who don't sleep ever again. They get drug addictions, they die, they overdose, they become homeless, right? But the fact that like these figures, Donald Rumsfeld can just go home and sleep fine, and is either a testament to their psychological personality disorders or whatnot, or truly about how we've offset these costs. And then the other thing is then there's no conversation about how Iraqis sleep at night after losing multiple family members, right? Or having ISIS come into one of their towns after everything went on for so long, and put their family into sex slavery, etc. Like we don't even talk about those realities.
Thank you for joining us in this conversation. In the next part, we discuss the question of what is an effective welfare policy. I hope you enjoyed visiting the Room of Lives today, and take care until next time.